Okay, guys, this is an in-class project that you're going to take on. The file is uploaded on Moodle. It is called Trump the Scientist, and it is a poster. You're going to do it, you're going to set it in InDesign, but you're going to create the graphics in Illustrator. So the story is very simple. Um, it's basically about how Trump has his own agenda when it comes to science, and he thinks he has a natural affinity for knowing a lot about science and the environment because he had an uncle that went to MIT. So one of the things that I want that we're going to do with this project is we're really going to test our abilities to create um, icons. And so you are going to use an icon or a set of icons to basically illustrate this article. So it's twofold. You have to set the article using some of the feedback that I gave you about type. So things line up, columns line up. There's some symmetry. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do with this project is work in a very symmetrical fashion. So there's a lot of different types of styles of design. So uh, asymmetrical, symmetrical. Symmetrical just means that for the most part, things sort of line up, and as you go down the page, you can see a real balance. It's a very easy, an easy way to design something, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be boring. So I've gone ahead last night and worked on this a little bit. So I read the story. I've given you some infographics so you can see down here. I've pulled out the infographics. Now, one of the things that I did with this, with my approach, was I wanted to work with what's called a monoline. And a monoline design or illustration is really just an icon that works with the same, relatively the same weight stroke on the icon. So instead of doing fills, we're basically doing strokes. And then I've carried on that stroke to actually set up a visual language throughout this poster that uses those strokes. So with mine, you can sort of see I've used an old serif. It's actually not old. It's uh, Mrs. Eves. I pulled some numbers out so you can see that there's some interest there. Then I've set the type underneath it, and then I've framed that sidebar in with text. And then it really is, if you see how it sort of lines up with the text above it, it really is symmetrical. So even though it's 4 across and my columns are 3 across, it's still very symmetrical. Then as you go up the page, you can sort of see I've added this little beaker icon to sort of introduce the story. And then I've taken the introduction, and instead of just sort of pasting it in there, I've sort of set it up so it becomes part of the illustration, and the word the scientist as well. So you don't have to go with the actual title of Trump the Scientist. You can just go the scientist, or you can go Trump the Scientist. So I've sort of put this, you can see my intro copy is, again, you'll see it's centered above all of my text. What I've done is I basically run the rules so they go to the outside of the columns. Then I've set my text. And look at how I've given it lots of white space in here so that it's basically easy to read, right? So it doesn't crush it. Then I've sort of gone with uh, basically an icon of Trump, and you can sort of see what I'm talking about with the mono rule. So everything on my icon is relatively the same line stroke. So I've sort of simplified Trump to a series of lines. His mouth becomes the top of the beaker, which gives it kind of another level. this you can sort of see I've actually split up the title itself, so it becomes Trump, then the scientist. So it's using a series of banners. You can see how I've used these rules on the sides. To set up a banner over top of him. So what this does is it's really now starting to design with the idea that our type and our image start working together as a sort of cohesive unit. And sometimes it does not have to be ornate like this. It can be much simpler, but with this one, I really wanted to give it kind of a like an old sort of 50s scientific feel to it. So I've given it kind of a lot of little icons and beakers and lines, and you can sort of see this figure one I've added, which gives it kind of that old scientific feel, while still trying to give it you know, a somewhat modern look and feel to it. So when you look at the entire thing, you can sort of see that relatively everything, when you start at the top of the page, is symmetrical. So there is Trump. It sits in the middle of the page. Still gives me some white space above, a little bit of white space here, and starts working as part of the illustration itself, as does the scientist, which is centered above the intro copy, which has rules out here that line up with my type, and then the type sits nicely. Under that, I've given myself some white space between the intro and the story. Another look at how there's white space after the story, and then a little bit of white space down here. Also look at the margins and columns. So some of the things that we were lacking in our type project was really setting up our margins and columns, and you can completely change them in InDesign. But what you want to do is have a nice sort of areas of white space where your eye can sort of breathe. And even with a very complicated, you know, sort of ornate illustration, you're still sort of getting sections where, you know, when you look out here, there's white. In between all the text, there's sections of white. So those are the subtle details. And the other thing is, I've done the entire illustration, and I've really just used straight type, right? So we're not outlining type, we're not doing outlines, we're not flipping it around upside down and vertical, that sort of thing. So that was one of the things, again, that I noticed in our last project in type, was that we were trying to draw a little bit too much with actual type. So you can use blocks of colors and things like that, but what I don't want you doing is actually taking the type and outlining it and that sort of thing. So it becomes, we're actually changing what the typeface looks like. There are times when I'll use like a drop shadow or something like that if I want to have like an old 50s or 60s feel to it. But you know, here's a great example of just setting type really nicely in a very symmetrical way, and letting the artwork sort of integrate with the type, and then looking at different levels of the type. So headline biggest, second part of the headline a little bit smaller, intro copy a little bit smaller, text a little bit smaller. Infographics, same size as the text, but the numbers get pulled out, and then everything is symmetrical. So all the lines are relatively, you know, you could split this entire page and flip it in half and it would still work. So you are going to do your own icon or illustration, but it's got to be based on Illustrator. You have to do it in Illustrator. It has to be using strokes, no colors, no fills. And it really has to say something about the story. So you want to read the story, thumbnail it out, do some thumbnail sketches, see if it'll work. Now, just because I put Trump in there doesn't necessarily mean you have to put Trump in there. You could read something about the story. So earlier this month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which encompasses the consensus finding of climate scientists worldwide, issued a report warning the effects of climate change may be irreversible by 2040. So there's some really interesting things in here. There's things about him. There's things about science. There's things about his uncle. All sorts of things. So if you want to do Trump, yeah, absolutely, you can do Trump. You can do, you can do an icon any way you want. It doesn't have to be sort of as stylized as mine, but just, sketch it out, figure out what you want to do. You're going to do it in Illustrator, then you will bring it from Illustrator into InDesign, where you will set the type. So there is a document ready for you for that. And this we will work on in class, and it will be due at the beginning of next class. So symmetrical design, single line icon, yeah, and that is it. Thanks.